Isn't it amazing how people way back in the day, like the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, used honey to help heal things?
Yeah, they were onto something, weren't they? Like, long before we had labs and fancy equipment to figure out why it worked.
Totally. They just knew, you know?
Right, just from watching and observing. And it makes you think, what else did they get right that we're just now starting to understand with science?
I know, right? It wasn't until the late 1800s that we actually discovered why honey was so good at fighting bacteria.
And that brings us to what we're really digging into today, Manuka honey.
Exactly. It comes from Australia and New Zealand, from bees that pollinate those tea trees, or Leptospermum scoparium bushes, if we're getting technical.
Gotta love a good scientific name.
Ah, right. So we've got a lot to unpack here. We want to get to the bottom of what makes Manuka honey so special,
What benefits it might have.
and what the actual science says about it all.
Because there are a lot of claims out there,
Oh, yeah.
ranging from just general descriptions to some pretty in-depth research.
So where do we even begin?
Well, first things first, we got to understand that not all honey is the same.
You mean like clover honey versus wildflower honey?
Yeah, that kind of thing. But I'm talking about how strong their antibacterial power is. Some honeys can be like 100 times stronger than others.
Wow, 100 times. That's a huge difference.
It is, and it really depends on a bunch of factors, like what kind of flowers the bees got the nectar from when the honey was harvested, even how it was handled afterwards.
So what gives regular honey that antibacterial quality anyway?
Okay, so most honey has hydrogen peroxide in it. It's a natural antibacterial thing that bees actually add to the nectar when they're making honey.
So it's like part of their process?
Exactly. But here's the thing about Manuka honey. It's got this extra antimicrobial punch on top of the hydrogen peroxide.
Okay, so it's like it's working on two levels.
You got it. And this extra power, it's not from hydrogen peroxide. It's something else entirely.
Intriguing. So what is it then? What gives Manuka honey that extra edge?
Well, the main player here is something called methyl glyoxal, or MGO for short. It's basically the big kahuna of antibacterial stuff in Manuka honey.
MGO, all right.
And the cool thing is this MGO comes from another compound called dihydroxyacetone, or DHA. And the nectar from those Manuka flowers, it's packed with DHA.
So as the bees are making the honey, they're basically transforming that DHA into MGO.
You got it. It's like a little chemistry lab inside the hive.
Pretty neat. So the more MGO, the stronger the Manuka honey, right?
Right on. And that's where the UMF rating system comes in.
Ah, UMF. I see that on the labels all the time.
Yeah, it stands for unique Manuka factor.
Okay.
And it's basically a way to tell people how potent the honey is. It measures the levels of MGO, DHA, and another compound called leptosprin. They all work together to make that unique Manuka magic.
So when I see that UMF number, I know I'm getting the real deal and how strong it is.
Exactly. Now, to be considered therapeutic grade, you generally want a UMF rating of at least 10 or higher.
10 plus, got it.
But it's worth noting that not all doctors and researchers are totally on board with how significant those UMF ratings are, medically speaking.
Interesting. It's like a helpful guide, but maybe not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, something like that. Now, you might also see other grading systems on Manuka honey, especially if you're in New Zealand.
Oh, yeah. I have seen a bunch of different labels. What's up with that?
So you might come across things like MGS, which stands for Molan Gold Standard,
Okay.
or K Factor, and Bioactive. And in New Zealand, those systems usually also measure MGO and something called NPA, which is non-peroxide activity.
Non-peroxide activity. That's that extra antibacterial action we were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly. It's the stuff that's not from hydrogen peroxide. And then over in Australia, they have their own grading system.
Oh, of course they do.
It's called AMHA, which is either authentic or authorized. And their labels, they have to show the MGO levels.
All right, so we've got UMF, MGS, K Factor, Bioactive, AMHA. It's a lot to keep track of.
I know, right? But here's the easiest way to make sure you're getting real Manuka honey. Look for those certifications: UMF, AMHA Authentic, or AMHA Authorized.
Okay, so those are the key things to look out for.
Yeah, those certifications tell you the honey's been tested and it's got those special compounds: leptosprin, DHA, and MGO. That's how you know it's authentic Manuka honey from New Zealand or Australia.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So let's talk about how people actually use Manuka honey.
Okay.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is putting it on cuts and burns.
You're right. That's the main thing people have been using and studying it for. It's really good for helping wounds and minor burns heal.
Because of those antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties we talked about?
Exactly. It's a powerful combination.
What about other things? Like, I've heard people say Manuka honey is good for skin problems or sore throats.
Yeah, there's definitely been some research into those areas.
But, like, is it really effective?
Well, the evidence is still kind of shaky. There have been studies looking at things like eczema, dermatitis, coughs, sore throats, even digestive health.
But we need more research to know for sure.
Exactly. It's promising, but we need more data.
That makes sense. So, say I have a really bad burn or a deep cut.
Mm-hmm.
Should I just grab the Manuka honey from my pantry?
That's a good question. But here's the thing. The Manuka honey you buy at the store, it's not the same as what doctors use for serious wounds.
Oh, really?
Yeah, medical-grade honey is specially sterilized and prepped to be used as a dressing. It's not like spreading it on toast.
Okay, so don't try that at home.
Definitely not. If you've got a serious wound, see a doctor. Don't mess around with it.
So what do the experts say about Manuka honey for burns and wounds then?
Well, there's this database, the Natural Medicines Comprehensive Database.
Catchy name.
Huh, right. They say honey in general is possibly effective for burns and wounds.
Possibly effective.
Yeah. And then there's the Cochrane Review. They do these really in-depth reviews of healthcare research, and they're like the gold standard.
So what do they say?
They say honey might help mild burns and surgical wounds heal faster compared to regular bandages.
Okay, so again, it's showing some potential.
But they also say we need more research to be sure.
It's like a broken record.
Kind of, yeah. But there are some other promising things that research has shown.
Like what?
Well, for one, Manuka honey might help prevent gum disease and inflammation.
That's good to know.
Right. It seems to do that by reducing plaque buildup.
I can see how that would work.
And there are even some smaller studies that suggest it might help prevent inflammation in the esophagus for people going through radiation or chemotherapy.
Oh, wow. That would be a huge help.
It could be, yeah. But again, more research is needed.
Right, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I find really fascinating about Manuka honey is its potential to fight antibiotic resistance.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because we're hearing more and more about those superbugs that are resistant to antibiotics.
And it's a serious problem.
It is. So how does Manuka honey fit into that?
Well, unlike those traditional antibiotics, honey, and Manuka honey specifically, doesn't seem to cause bacteria to become resistant.
That's incredible. Why is that?
It might be because honey is so complex. It's got all these different compounds working together, so it's harder for bacteria to figure out how to fight it.
That makes sense. So it's like hitting them from all angles.
Yeah, something like that.
But we also need to acknowledge that a lot of the research on Manuka honey has been done on a pretty small scale, right?
That's true. Many of the studies have had a limited number of participants.
And there are still a lot of things we don't know.
Right. For example, there's no solid evidence that Manuka honey can help with high cholesterol or really change the balance of bacteria in your gut.
Okay.
And while there's been some research on its effects on cancer, diabetes, and fungal infections, those haven't shown clear benefits yet.
So promising, but not a cure-all.
Exactly. We need to be realistic about what the science actually shows.
So you mentioned earlier that we were going to focus on Manuka honey and stomach problems. And that's something a lot of people struggle with, right?
Oh yeah, stomach issues are super common.
I feel like I'm always hearing about people having digestive problems.
Right. And a lot of times it comes down to things like diet, stress, or even bacterial infections like H. pylori.
H. pylori, that's the one that can cause ulcers, right?
Exactly. So researchers have been looking into whether Manuka honey can help with these kinds of stomach problems.
And what have they found?
Well, some studies suggest it could be good for things like ulcerative colitis, gastritis, and even ulcers themselves.
Really?
Yeah. Often it's recommended alongside lifestyle changes like diet modifications.
That makes sense. So it's not like a magic bullet, but it could be part of a bigger solution.
Right. And there's research on Manuka honey as a natural way to help with GERD and acid reflux, too.
Well, that's interesting. Because those are both really common problems.
Oh, for sure. It's estimated that like 72% of adults experience some kind of gastrointestinal issue regularly.
Wow, 72%.
Yeah. So there's definitely a need for more options to help people with these kinds of issues.
Absolutely. So you mentioned H. pylori earlier. What does the research say about Manuka honey and that bacteria specifically?
Okay, so there's some really cool research coming out of the University of Auckland. This researcher, Dr. Fiona Radcliffe, she's been studying how Manuka honey affects H. pylori in the lab.
And what has she found?
Well, her studies consistently show that the higher the UMF rating of the Manuka honey, the better it is at stopping H. pylori from growing and actually killing it.
Okay, so that UMF number really does matter.
Yeah, it seems to make a big difference. Her research found that a UMF 25 plus honey was 4 times more effective than a UMF 5 plus honey.
Wow, that's significant.
Right. And even more interesting, both of those were way more effective than just regular honey from the supermarket.
So it's not just about the honey being thick and sugary. There's something special about Manuka honey itself.
Exactly. And here's another really interesting thing she found. Even small amounts of Manuka honey, like 5% volume per volume, were enough to completely stop H. pylori from growing in the lab.
Wow, so you don't need a ton of it to see an effect?
Apparently not. But here's the kicker. They tried using artificial solutions that mimicked the physical properties of honey, like the thickness and sweetness.
Okay.
And those didn't work at all.
Really? So it's not just about those physical properties. There's something else in Manuka honey that's doing the trick.
Exactly. It's like it's got a secret weapon.
I love it. So what does all this mean for other stomach problems that involve inflammation, like ulcerative colitis?
Well, there have been some studies in rats that show giving them Manuka honey by mouth can actually reduce inflammation in their colon.
And inflammation is a big part of ulcerative colitis.
Yeah, it's a key feature.
Right.
And while these rat studies look promising, we really need more research in humans to see if it works the same way.
Of course, always got to be cautious with those animal studies.
Right. But there's another study that suggests Manuka honey might help reduce inflammation in ulcerative colitis by increasing antioxidant activity in the gut.
So it's like it's fighting inflammation on multiple fronts.
Yeah, that's the idea.
What about gastritis and ulcers?
There's been research on that too. Some studies suggest Manuka honey might be effective in treating chronic ulcers and protecting the stomach lining.
Interesting. So it's not just fighting the bacteria, it's also helping the stomach heal.
That's right. It's thought to be due to its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties.
That makes sense. What about gastroenteritis?
Some researchers think Manuka honey might even be better than those traditional oral rehydration solutions for gastroenteritis.
Really? Because of its antibacterial properties?
Yeah, that and the fact that it might help good bacteria in the gut to grow.
That's fascinating. So aside from the research, what are people saying about using Manuka honey for stomach problems?
Well, there are a lot of anecdotal reports out there. People say it helps with things like indigestion, gut inflammation, and even GERD symptoms.
GERD, that's acid reflux, right?
Yeah. And they're using different UMF grades like 15 plus or 26 plus, depending on what they're trying to address.
So it seems like there's a lot of experimentation going on.
There is. But when it comes to GERD specifically, people say the honey helps by coating the esophagus and soothing the irritation from acid reflux.
Okay, that makes sense.
Some people are taking a spoonful multiple times a day, even before meals and at bedtime.
But the research on Manuka honey and GERD isn't quite there yet, right?
Yeah, it's still pretty inconclusive. So it's always best to talk to your doctor before trying Manuka honey for GERD or any other medical condition.
Good advice. So if someone is thinking about trying Manuka honey for their stomach, what should they do?
Well, if it's just for general digestive support, a spoonful a day is a common recommendation.
Okay.
You can also mix it into drinks or food, but make sure they're not too hot because heat can destroy some of the beneficial compounds.
Good tip. What about UMF rating? Does that matter?
It can. If you're dealing with a specific stomach problem where you need a strong antibacterial effect, you probably want to go with a higher UMF grade, like 20 plus, 24 plus, 26 plus, or even higher.
Because those have more MgO.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are some good resources online that can help you figure out which UMF grade is right for your needs.
That's helpful. Now, are there any downsides to Manuka honey? Any risks or side effects people should know about?
Yeah, there are a few things to keep in mind. Some people are allergic to bees or bee products, so they could have a reaction to Manuka honey.
Makes sense.
And like any type of honey, if you eat too much of it, it can raise your blood sugar.
Right, because it's basically sugar.
Yeah. And there's also a chance it could interact with certain medications, like chemotherapy drugs.
Oh, so it's important to talk to your doctor if you're taking any medications.
Definitely. And never give honey to babies under a year old.
Because of the risk of botulism.
Exactly. And if you have diabetes, you should talk to your doctor before using Manuka honey because of its sugar content.
Got it. So we've talked a lot about stomach problems, but let's zoom back out and look at the bigger picture of Manuka honey's antibacterial power.
Okay.
And all the research that's being done on it.
So Manuka honey gets its medicinal power from the Manuka flowers themselves and their high levels of phenolic compounds.
Phenolic compounds, those are like antioxidants, right?
Yeah, they can be. And remember that UMF rating, it's not just about the MgO, it also reflects how much of these phenolic compounds are in the honey.
Interesting. So a higher UMS means more antioxidants too.
It could, yeah. Now here's another interesting thing. Different kinds of Manuka honey seem to have different effects on different bacteria.
Like some are better at fighting certain types of bacteria than others.
Exactly. And there's some evidence that those gram-negative bacteria, the ones with the Tucker cell walls, might be more resistant to Manuka honey than gram-positive bacteria.
That's something to keep in mind.
It is. But one of the most exciting things about Manuka honey is that bacteria haven't developed resistance to it.
We talked about that earlier, but it's worth repeating.
It is. It's a huge deal, especially with the problem of antibiotic resistance getting worse and worse.
Totally. Why do you think that is? Why haven't bacteria become resistant to honey?
Well, honey is like a super complex cocktail of ingredients. It's got all these different compounds working together, so it's really hard for bacteria to evolve ways to survive it.
It's like throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them.
Yeah, kind of. And research has even shown that Manuka honey can actually change the shape and size of bacterial cells.
Really? How does it do that?
It's not totally clear, but it seems to mess with their ability to function properly, which can stop them from growing and multiplying.
So it's not just killing them, it's also disrupting their whole system.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. Manuka honey can also boost the body's own immune response.
So it's helping our bodies fight back even better.
That's right. It's been shown to stimulate macrophages, which are like the Pac-Man of the immune system.
Pac-Man.
Yeah, they go around and gobble up all the bad stuff, like bacteria and damaged cells.
Okay, I get it. That's a good analogy.
And on top of that, Manuka honey has shown some antioxidant and even anti-cancer properties in lab studies.
Wow, so it's like multi-talented.
It really is. But of course, we need more research to see how those findings translate to real-life situations.
Always. So we've talked about the antibacterial power of Manuka honey, but what exactly gives it that power?
Well, it's a combination of things. We've got the MgO and the hydrogen peroxide, of course.
Right.
But it's also got this high sugar content, which creates something called osmotic pressure.
Osmotic pressure, that sounds complicated.
It's not that bad. Basically, it means that the honey draws water out of the bacteria, which can kill them.
Oh, so it's like dehydrating them.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And Manuka honey is also slightly acidic, which can inhibit bacterial growth.
And then there are all those other beneficial compounds we talked about.
Exactly. It's a whole team effort.
Now, you mentioned biofilms earlier. Those are like those bacterial communities that are really hard to get rid of, right?
Yeah, they're like little fortresses for bacteria.
And they cause a lot of problems with chronic infections.
They do. But research suggests that Manuka honey might be able to stop these biofilms from forming in the first place.
Really? How?
It seems to do that by stressing out the bacteria, preventing them from building those protective structures.
Clever.
And it can also break down existing biofilms by killing the bacteria inside.
That's amazing. So it's like a double whammy against biofilms?
Yeah, you could say that. And the best part is the bacteria that escape from these treated biofilms, they don't seem to develop resistance to the honey.
That's great news. So what about those studies that compare different UMF grades against specific bacteria?
Okay, so they've done research looking at different UMF grades against Staphylococcus aureus, which is a common bacteria that can cause infections.
Right.
And the results show that the higher the UMF rating, the better it is at fighting those bacteria.
Which makes sense because higher UMF means more MgO.
And more phenolic compounds, too.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that other factors can affect the honey's effectiveness, too. Things like where the bees got the nectar from, the weather conditions during the honey flow, even how the honey is stored.
So it's not as simple as just looking at the UMF number.
Right. There's a lot that goes into it.
And we talked about this before, but there's that thing about gram-negative bacteria being potentially more resistant to Manuka honey.
Yeah, that's still an area that needs more research. They've got those tougher cell walls, so it might be harder for the honey to penetrate them.
Makes sense. What about those in vivo studies you mentioned? The ones that look at what happens inside a living organism.
Yeah, those are really important because they can show us how Manuka honey actually works in a more realistic setting.
And they've been looking at its effects on biofilms in conditions like chronic sinusitis, right?
That's right. And the results have been pretty interesting.
So what about combining Manuka honey with antibiotics? That seems like it could be a really powerful strategy.
It could be. There's been research in the lab that shows Manuka honey can actually boost the effectiveness of certain antibiotics.
So 1 + 1 = 3.
Exactly. It's called a synergistic effect.
And in some cases, it might even help reverse antibiotic resistance.
Yeah, they've seen that with antibiotics like oxacillin, which is used against MRSA and rifampicin.
But it's not always a slam dunk, right?
Right. It depends on the specific antibiotic. Sometimes the combination can actually be less effective.
So it's not a universal solution. It needs to be studied carefully.
Definitely. Now, I know we've talked about a lot of positive things about Manuka honey, but it's important to be honest about the limitations, too.
Of course. There are always two sides to every story.
Right. And there was this one clinical trial where they tested Manuka honey on people with H. pylori infections,
Okay.
and it didn't work.
Really? But those lab studies we talked about earlier showed it was effective against H. pylori.
I know, it's surprising, right? But it just goes to show that what works in a petri dish doesn't always work the same way in a human body.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways about Manuka honey?
Okay, so here's the bottom line. Manuka honey has some pretty amazing antibacterial properties, mostly because of that MGO compound.
And the UMF rating tells us how much MGO's in there.
Right. And while lab studies have shown a lot of promise for Manuka honey in different areas, and it's definitely been helpful for wound healing.
Especially for those tough infections that are resistant to antibiotics.
Yeah, that's a big one. But for other uses, especially when it comes to internal problems like stomach issues, the evidence is still kind of mixed.
And sometimes contradictory, like those H. pylori findings.
Exactly. So Manuka honey, it's not a miracle cure, but it definitely has potential in certain areas.
And more research is always needed.
Absolutely. And it's super important to talk to your doctor before using Manuka honey as a treatment, especially if you have any allergies or health conditions.
Always good advice. This has been a fascinating deep dive. I've learned so much.
But too.
It makes you wonder what other natural remedies are out there that we just haven't fully explored yet.
Right, like what other secrets is nature hiding?
And how can we use both traditional knowledge and modern science to unlock those secrets and benefit from them?
It's an exciting thought.
It is. Who knows what amazing discoveries are still waiting to be made?
I can't wait to find out.
Me neither.